Lately, I've been receiving a lot of requests to recreate a bunch of different parts of Dennis Sneelenberg's portfolio. Honestly, I tried to think of how I could split everything in different videos, but I said, fuck it, I'll just remake the whole page. And also, big shout out to Dennis for this website, all credits to him, he's an amazing developer. So, the portfolio has a bunch of different moving parts. I decided to split them into 7 main components, with 2 extra components that will be shared among the others. The main tech stack for this landing page will be Nextjs as the React framework, SAS for the styling, Locomotive Scroll for the smooth scroll and the parallax, and Framer Motion and GSAP for all of the animations. And if you're interested, you can find the source code and the live demo in the description below. Now in my past videos, I already took a look at the landing page and the project component, and so I've integrated them in the project right now so we can save some time. And I've also initialized a locomotive scroll just to have a smooth scroll, and so we have something like this for a starter project. Now the first component will be the header. So here I start from the structure that I created in my previous video for the curved menu, and I add some HTML and CSS using the translate X value, the padding right, and all of that with an overflow hidden. And with that, we have this nice logo animation. And the next step is to work on the nav. Here we have like an indicator, so this can be made very quickly using HTML and CSS. We can see that we have a nice little indicator. Now I've also put the burger menu in scale 0. If I put it back to scale 1, you're going to see that we have like 2 menus overlapping on top of each other. So what I want to do is initialize it at scale 0, and then I'm going to use GSAP to animate it and make it appear after a certain amount of scroll. Alright, here I initialize a use layout effect hook, and I initialize the scroll trigger plugin for GSAP, and then I create a ref for the burger. And with that, we're ready to add a scroll trigger animation on the burger menu. So what I'm going to do here is do a gsap.to, and I will target the burger.current because it's a ref, and I will create here a scroll trigger, and the trigger will be the document. The start will be 0. The end will be a full height of the window, and then I can add a on leave and a on enter back. And it's here that I will animate the scale of the burger. And so what I can do is a gsap2, and I can do the burger.current, and I can go ahead and change the scale. When we leave, we change the scale back to 1. And then when we enter back, it's the reverse. We're going to do 0. And then I can add a little transition. And if I save that, I can see here that the burger menu is initialized at scale 0. And then when I scroll for 100 viewport height, the burger menu appears, and I can click on it and trigger the menu. And if I scroll back up, the scale is resetted back to 0. And with that, we have a really nice header. And the next component will be the description. Here I create the description component, and I import it inside of the page.js. Then I create some simple HTML and CSS. I have a phrase that I split into individual words so that I can then animate them. And then I add some CSS to make everything look good. And with that, I have a nice simple layout here. And the good thing is our paragraph here is separated into words, so I can then animate this using Framer Motion. So for the animation, I create an anim.js file where I create an opacity and a slide up animation, and I add a motion on the span and on the second paragraph. And then I use the use in view hook from Framer Motion to check when the container comes inside of the view, and I can control the animation with that. And as a result, if we scroll in, we can see that the description gets animated. We have an opacity on this paragraph, and here we have a word by word animation. But the problem here is there is no delay between the words. They all appear at the same time, and we can easily fix that by passing here a custom value, and we can give the index. And then we can go here inside of the animation, and the slide up animation here will have the index here, and we can have a delay here, and we can do like 0.01 multiplied by the index. And if we save that, we now have a word by word animation with a slight delay. We could have like one even more just to show you guys. And here we have a word by word animation, but obviously that's a bit too much. I'm just going to fix it to maybe 0.02. And now we have a nice word by word animation. And then we're ready to work on the button here. It's the last element. There is a slight parallax, so we can do that with locomotive scroll. So here I'm adding some basic HTML and CSS to make a simple button. And with that, we have a nice button here. It's placed in position absolute, so it's like in a nice place. And then if we want to add a parallax on top of that, we can simply go in the parent container here of the button, and we can do data scroll, meaning we want this element to be observed by the locomotive library. And then we can do data scroll speed to create a parallax, and then we can do like 0.1. And with that, we can see that there is a nice parallax, right? The button is not moving at the same speed than the rest of the elements. And now we'll increase the level of difficulty with the sliding images component. Framer motion is used here to track the progress of the scroll, and we can use that progress to animate the sliders and the overlapping circle. So for the sliders, I import two arrays containing objects with a certain color and a certain source, and then I use HTML to create a slider container, and I map those arrays to return a project with a next image inside of them, and then I add some styling to make everything look good. I make sure the slider has a width that's a bit bigger than the size of the window, and with that I have a nice slider here, and I want to be able to translate on the x-axis the sliders on scroll. And I'm going to start by importing two hooks from Framer Motion. One of them is the use scroll, and the other one is the use transform. And then I've created a ref for the container and I've added it to the div. And now what I want to do is track the progress of the scroll. And what we can do here is extract the scroll Y progress from the use scroll hook of Framer Motion. And we can specify here, because if we don't specify anything, we're gonna have the scroll Y progress of the entire document. And that's not what we want. We want only the progress of the container that we've created here. And so what we can do is specify a container to be the container that we just created, and then we can specify the offset that we want, because we see here that the scroll progress returns a value between 0 and 1, and so we need to specify like an offset to basically tell Framer Motion what do we want to be 0 and what do we want to be 1, right? And in our case, we want the 0 to be this starting point here, basically when the bottom of the window hits the top of the container. And so what we can do here is specify the offset to be, we said, the start of the container and the end of the window. And then the end would be at the end here, which would be the top of the window and the bottom of the container. And so what we would do is end of the container and the start of the window. And with that, we have a value between 0 and 1, depending on the scroll, starting from this point here until this point here. And with that, we can create two X values. So one for the first slider and one for the second slider, right? So we can start with the first one, and we're going to use the use transform hook, and we're going to give as a value to transform the scroll Y progress, and then we can specify 0 and 1. Those are the values of the scroll Y progress, and we want to transform those values to be 0 and 150. And so that means that we can translate on the x-axis from 0 to 150 depending on the progress of the scroll. And then we can create another value, and this one we're going to do it on the other side. And then I've added a motion on the two slider, and I can specify a style, and I can say the x should be the x1 that I defined here for the first slider, and the second slider, the x should be the x2. And then here I need to change, it's not the container, it's the target. And if I save that, I can see that I have now my slider moving left and right, which is exactly what we want. And now I'm going to work on this overlay circle here. So for the circle, I add two divs, and then I go into styling and I create a box shadow, and I give a crazy high height and a big width of 120% with a left 10% so that it's a bit bigger than the window. And then I give a border radius at the bottom to have a circular div. You can see that we have a massive div here with a circle. If I animate the height of the container, I can do like 25. I can see that it's reducing the height. If I do 10, it's almost a null curve, and that's because the circle here has a height that depends on the parent. And so I'm going to leave the height at 0 at first, and then I'm going to go in the JavaScript and I'm going to create another transform. I'm going to do one for the height. I'll animate initially a height of 50 that will go to 0 when the scroll progress reaches 1, and then I can take that height, add a motion, and give the height to the circle container. And if I save that, we can see that we have a nice circle. Now I cannot scroll more than that. I'm just going to add some margin bottom to show you guys here. And here we can see that we have a circle, and when we scroll, it gets flattened more and more, and we have like a nice shadow. And so of course now it looks weird, but with the footer, it's going to look great. If we look at the demo, we can see that the footer will be underneath, and it's going to make a lot more sense than it does now. Now it looks a bit weird, but it's going to make sense. After that, we can now work on the contact component, which is like the footer. Alright, so here's the footer. I went ahead and skipped the HTML and the CSS part because it's a lot of small details that are not really relevant to the animations. And as you can see, when I scroll, we still have like this curve here from the circle of these sliding images. And so what we can do is go back in these sliding images here, and instead of putting the height at 0 when the scroll progress is 1, we can reduce that. When the scroll progress is equal to 0.8, then we want to have a 0 of height. And with that, we're going to make sure we have a straight line. Maybe you can do like 0.9. And with that, we have a nice straight line when we reach the bottom of the footer. Now, if we look at the demo here, we can see that there are 3 animations on the footer. There's one on the arrow, one on the button, and one on the container itself. So we can start with those two smaller elements, and we're going to use the same concept as the sliding images. We're going to use the use transform and the use scroll from firmware motion. And so here I've added a container to the main container and initialized a scroll Y progress using the container as the target. And then I need to specify an offset, and that's always the tricky part when it comes to using the use scroll hook. So we can take a look here at the footer, and we basically want to start tracking when the window is at the bottom and it's the top of the container. So we can do at the start of the container and at the end of the window. And then the end should be here, the end of the container and the end of the window as well. So we can do end. And now we effectively have a nice scroll Y progress that we can use inside of a use transform. So here I have an X value and a rotate value that uses that progress. For the X, it goes from 0 to 100 pixels, and the rotation goes from 120 degrees to 90 degrees. And I can now use those values to add them to the button and the arrow. So for the button here, I've added a motion and a style with the X. And for the arrow, I've added the motion as well and specified the rotation, and I put the scale to just to have it a bit bigger. And if I try this here, we can see that the arrow is rotating and we can see that the button is translating on the line, which is a really nice effect. And the last thing we want to add is a parallax on the footer. If we look at the demo here, we can see that the footer here is almost fixed. So it is still scrolling, but almost not at all. And we can create that by basically creating a force that will go in the opposite direction of the scroll. And so what that means is we want to create a Y value that's going to go in the negative, and that way it's going to go against the scroll, and it will give the illusion that the footer is not really scrolling. So we can create that pretty easily using the same thing. We're going to use the use transform hook, and then we're going to use the scroll Y progress from 0 to 1, and then we're going to initialize the Y at -500 to 0. And then if I put that Y to the main container, I can see that my footer here has initially a Y of -500, and that's why it's like overlapping on top of the sliding images component. And then if I scroll down, it kind of goes back into place. And so that's exactly what we want. It might look messy, but all we need to do is just adjust the Z index and put a background white on these sliding images. So I'm going to go here in these sliding images, and I can do a Z index 2 and a background color white. And now it's overlapping on top of the footer, and we have this nice parallax effect on the footer very easily. And with all of that, we have a very nice landing page. We have all of our components integrated in the page. We have a nice footer, sliding images, a nice project gallery, a description, and the landing page. And we have this nice menu here that transforms into a burger menu. So now that all the main components are integrated, we can create an introduction to the website. So the first thing we want to do here for the introduction is create a state that will track if our animation is loaded or not. So we can have here a const is loading, set is loading here. So now that we have a state, we can do conditional rendering. If the app is loading, then we want to return the preloader. And then we can go ahead and create the preloader as a component here. And in this landing page, we don't have any data fetching. So all we need to do is set that initially, yes, the app is loading. And then we can manually add a timeout to set the loading to false after 2 seconds. And if we refresh the page, we can see that we are loading, and after 2 seconds, it disappears. And then we can also go in the global CSS here and specify that the cursor should be initially a wait cursor. And then in the JavaScript, we're gonna reset that cursor to default. So if I refresh the page, we have a wait cursor, and after 2 seconds, the loading disappears and our cursor becomes the default again. And now I'm just adding a class name and some styling to make the loader take the full width and the full height of the window. And with that, I have a nice loader that's on top of everything else. But now it looks a bit weird, right? It's just it appears and it disappears. And since we are mounting and unmounting the component, what we can add is the animate presence hook from firmware motion, and we can put it in mode wait, and that will basically force the preloader to have its exit animation before unmounting. So here I'm creating an anim.js file where I declare an animation that will slide the division up, and then I go in the HTML and I add the motion in front of the div. I specify the variance, an initial and an exit value. And if I save this and I refresh, we can see that we have the loading, and then the animation will unmount and we have this nice effect. And then for the text animation, I add an array of words and I use the use effect hook to be triggered every time I set the index, and I add a timeout with a certain delay depending at which index we are at. And then I add a paragraph with the word of the current index, and I go in the anim.js and I add a slight opacity animation. And if I save that, we can see that we have this nice text animation. And honestly, it's a decent loading animation, but we can add an extra touch of it by adding a curve. And we're basically gonna make that curve the same way that we're making the curve for the menu here. We're gonna use an SVG and animate it using firmware motion. So here I create a state that will encapsulate the dimension of the window, and then I can add a conditional rendering and only return the paragraph and the SVG if the height exists. And then I define my initial path by drawing a custom SVG using the quadratic Bezier curve to create a curve. And then I add some styling just to make everything look good. And if we save that, we can see that we have our text here, and then we have a curve. And now all we need to do is animate that curve using firmware motion. So I'm going to create here a target path, and I'm going to reset the curve back to a null point. And then I can create the curve animation here, and I can add a transition the same as for the slide up animation here. And then I just add a motion to the path with the curve as a variant. And if I save that, we should have our introduction component working here. But there's one bug that could occur, and that's if I go on the website and then in the loading, I decide to scroll. I go up here, I end up in the place where I scrolled. So what we can do to avoid that is in the page.js here, we also want to do a window.scroll2, and then we're going to scroll to 0, 0, and that will avoid to have like this weird bug if the user decides to scroll. So we're now ready to add some polishing to this landing page. So we can start the polishing process by creating a reusable component for the buttons. So this is essentially what we're trying to do. We're gonna have a button here that can take any size, for example, this size here, or this size here, and this size here, right? And what we wanna do is have a circle that's going to be at the bottom here at first. And then when we hover, that circle is gonna slide up. And then when we hover out, that circle is going to slide away on top. All right, so here I'm creating a button component. It's going to be a div with some styling, and it's going to return the children and the circle. And as a parameter, it's going to take a background color and any amount of attributes that we want. And then I go inside of the description and I replace the button as an example. And so here I've added some styling to the circle. We have a height of 150% and a width of 100%. And so here it is. And now we need to find a way to make it slide up the button when we hover. So I've added 2 mouse events to the main division here. And we're basically going to use GSAP to animate all of that. So we need to create a reference to the circle. So we can have here a circle and create a reference. So for now, let's try to move that circle up a bit. So we can do on mouse enter, we can create a GSAP2. And then we can target here the circle, and then we can try moving the top value here. Let's try to do like minus 25% with a duration of like 0.4 seconds. And then if I try this, I'm going to hover and see the circle is perfectly centered with the button because it has a height of 150%. And so minus 25% will center it perfectly on the y-axis. And inside of that mouse sleeve, I'm going to slide the circle even higher. So I can do minus 150%. If I hover, the circle is moving inside. And if I hover out, the circle is now moving away. And that way we can create this kind of curve animation. So I'm going to add here an overflow hidden to the main container of the button. And if I try this with an overflow hidden, it kind of gives the illusion of creating a curve. And I can create this illusion even more by boosting the width to maybe 150% on mouse enter and the width to maybe 125% on mouse leave. And now if I try this, it looks really clean. But we have a problem. The animation only works once and we have to refresh the page. What we could do to fix that problem really quickly is add another GSAP2 and put it back to where it was in the beginning. We now have the animation working fine. And if I hover very fast, it works fine. But we're gonna have a problem when we start changing the duration. So I'm gonna put the duration that I want. Now it kind of gets buggy. It works if I don't do anything weird, but if I start moving my mouse really fast like this, it kind of gets buggy. And it's quite a problem if I use this technique. What we can do is use the timeline of GSAP. And instead of putting the 2 directly here, I'm just going to target the timeline and do a tween from to. And so the from value will be a label. I want to do the enter to the exit, meaning it's going to start at the enter and it's going to go to the exit. It's not going to play the exit animation though. And then when we leave the mouse, what we want to do is just do a play. And if I try this, this works really well. And if I move my mouse in a weird way, we can see that we don't have the problem that we had before. And then we can add a little extra step to make this even cleaner. If we look at the demo here, we can see that the button, if I leave my mouse and then I quit, it stays, the circle stays a bit longer, right? It kind of stays. And then if I move my mouse fast, it leaves right away. So this is a really nice little detail that we can add. So what we can do to create this effect is create a timeout of like 0.2 seconds, but let's do 0.3 seconds. But this can create a bug and I can show it like this. See how it goes away without my mouse leaving? I'm gonna go fast and it just goes away. That's a bug. And so what we can do to fix that final problem is create here a timeline, not a timeline, a timeout ID. And we're gonna have it at null at first. And then when we create a timeout, we're gonna basically set that timeout ID value to be this timeout. And then we can check that if there is a timeout ID, then we want to clear the timeout with that timeout ID. And then I'm gonna do the timeout ID is equal to null. So with that, we have a really nice button. If we hover and we leave, it stays for a bit. If we go fast, it goes away, and there is no bug with the button. And finally, we can create a magnetic effect to most clickable elements by creating a wrapper that will clone the children that can then be animated with GSAP. So here I have the basic magnetic component. I simply want to return the element. So what I could do is do children like this. And so that way it's going to return everything that is wrapped under this magnetic component. But I also want to add a magnetic reference to it so that I can then add like effects with mouse events listener and all of that. So what I can do here, instead of returning the raw children, what I can do is do react and do a clone element. And I need to remove the brackets here. And then I'm going to basically clone the children, and I'm going to add a reference being the magnetic element. And then for example, I can go inside of the button. It's really convenient. What I can do is import the magnetic here, and I can simply wrap the button inside of the magnetic component. And that way everything we do in the magnetic component will also be applied to the button. And then here I have the mouse event listeners that I added on the magnetic reference. And then to start moving the element, what I will use is the quick to function from GSAP. So I'm going to create a Next2 and a Y2. And this technique here is the same that I used to create this project gallery, to create like this moving modal. So if you're interested, you can check out this tutorial. All right, so here I have the X2 and the Y2 function, which are quick to functions by GSAP. This is the magnetic effect that we're trying to create. If I move my mouse out, I basically want to reset the X and the Y to 0. So what I can do is on mouse leave, X to 0 and Y to 0. That's pretty logical, right? When we leave the mouse, we reset back everything to 0. And it has like this wobbly effect because we are using the elastic easing. And then to tell the element to move at a certain position, what we can do is extract the client X and the client Y from the event. And then we could try to do X2 and target the client X and the client Y. Okay, so it's definitely really buggy. I can see that the mouse leave function is fine, but I feel like it's not getting the right position. So to have like the accurate position that we want, we need to subtract the position of the current element. And so for that, we can extract the width, the height, the left and the top value of the magnetic element by getting, first of all, the magnetic element and then getting the bounding client rect. What we need to do is, for example, on the X, we're gonna have the client X and we need to subtract the left position, but also add the width divided by 2. And for the height, it's going to be the same thing. And we are adding here the width divided by 2 and the height divided by 2 because the top and left position are like the top left corner. And so we need to add half of the width and half of the height to have like the center value. And with that, we should have something that makes much more sense. And we now have a nice magnetic button. But it's kind of moving a lot. So what we can do is simply reduce that value by maybe 0.5, and then we're gonna put back the reset to 0. And with that, we have a super nice magnetic effect. And so what I do here is I go across all of the application and I add the magnetic to the elements that I want. And I also add the button to the button that I want. And so now I've added the magnetic and the button across the website. And we can see that I have here a magnetic on the header. I have the magnetic on the button here as well, and on the footer here, and also have it on the header. And that's the power of reusable components. And I think that with that, we are officially done with the landing page. It was a lot of work. It was a long tutorial. Let me know in the comment section if you prefer like smaller tutorials or if you like big ones like this one. I'm still unsure which format is the best, so please give me your feedback. And also if you like the video, if you learned something, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.